Hello, this is Martin Lewis, Senior Lecturer Emeritus at Stanford University, and this is the first substantive lecture in the GeoCurrents series on the history and geography of natural psychoactive substances. Today's lecture is part one of alcohol. Basic outline, I'll go through this pretty quickly. I'll talk about the harm and potential benefits of alcohol consumption. I'll spend a little more time on the nature of alcohol and the process of fermentation. I'll then move on to the early history of alcohol production and consumption in the Neolithic period. I'll spend a little time on beer in ancient Sumer or Sumeria, usually considered the world's first urban civilization in Mesopotamia, today's Iraq. Then I'll move on to wine in the ancient Mediterranean world. I'll talk about it as well in medieval and early modern Persia or Iran. And finally, I'll talk about beer in medieval and early modern Europe and cider in Europe and early America. Then, second lecture on alcohol, we'll move into distilled spirits, prohibitions, current patterns of alcohol use, and so on. So one thing to note is that alcohol is the most commonly used psychoactive substance after caffeine. It's interesting, caffeine is mild enough that it's often not included in these sort of measurements. If it were, caffeine, coffee, tea, etc. would be number one. But excluding caffeine, alcohol is definitely in the first place. In the United States, certainly. About 61% of the population uses alcohol. Tobacco is number two at about half that, marijuana or cannabis about half that again. How harmful is it? Well, by some measurements, it's the most harmful recreational drug of all. This is a graph derived from a study of experts in the United Kingdom on drug harm, and they note both harm to others and basically harm to society and harm to users. As far as harm to users go, they put alcohol in the fourth position, but considering its social damage, they rated it as the most harmful of all. Now, this is just one measurement. There are many others, and they contradict this finding. So here's another one that's based on German addiction experts. And they put alcohol as the fourth most harmful after crack cocaine, methamphetamine, and no surprise, heroin, but actually at a higher level of harm overall than powdered cocaine or amphetamine, which may be surprising, may or may not be true as well. Again, we can look at other measurements. Here's a little graph that's commonly found on the internet, and you could see on the horizontal scale, we have physical harm, and then on the vertical, dependence or addiction potential. And you could see heroin is at the upper right corner and alcohol considerably lower, both in terms of physical harm and dependence, which I suspect is approaches the truth a bit more than some of the others. Note, though, that it is still much more harmful and addicting than cannabis. And this particular graph puts cannabis in a fairly high position for dependence and physical harm. It varies a lot from graph to graph. As far as toxicity goes, alcohol is definitely down a few steps, although much higher than many commonly used drugs, including cocaine, interestingly enough, and vastly higher than something like LSD or cannabis, marijuana. And just to note what toxicity refers to as the median effective dose expressed as a percentage of the median lethal dose. So this is one reason why fentanyl is so destructive, although heroin is not far behind it, is take 4 times the effective dose and you've reached the lethal dose. So that's main reason why there are so many deaths by overdose of fentanyl and heroin as well. Now, as far as the benefits or potential benefits of alcohol consumption go, I would urge interested people to read the key text on this subject, historian Edward Slingerland's Drunk, How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. Slingerland has a very powerful argument. Of course, many other scholars would disagree with it, so I don't want to say this is the last word on the subject. It's merely one word, but it's Slingerland has a powerful voice in this. So he emphasizes the potential benefits in terms of creativity. He argues that alcohol and other drugs can sort of take the prefrontal cortex, the most evolved part of the brain that really regulates our behavior, can kind of take it offline to a certain degree and allow more sort of free-floating thought, which can enhance creativity. This is an interesting but arguable thesis. It is true that many highly creative people, artists, musicians, and so on, have used alcohol extensively. Many of them have used it, have overused it, and have caused considerable harm to themselves and others. But many of these authors and artists, and musicians, and others would argue that alcohol does have benefits. And we'll see later on the same thing is said about cannabis and other drugs as well. I think a bit more powerful line of reasoning that Slingerland and others have is that alcohol is very important for social bonding, to get people to engage in common activity. They let down their guards. They become a little more open and free with each other, and that and can have fun as well, and that can bring the group together. And not just the in-group. It's a pretty easy argument to make, but a more interesting argument is it can create bonding outside of the in-group. If you have former enemies wanting to make peace, they have often done so through drinking rituals. Now, sometimes those drinking rituals collapse into brawls and the peace ends, because alcohol can certainly increase aggression in the right circumstances. But in the correct circumstances, it can also create camaraderie and reduce tensions. So it's a sort of a double-edged sword as this goes. But it's interesting, in a lot of cultures that emphasize drinking, you have sort of semi-ritualized ways to bring people together. A good example would be Japanese businesses and their, it used to be essentially almost nightly drinking rituals together, which is associated with a lot of problems, and I won't go into those. But one of the main ideas is to get people in different divisions of a company to drink together so they can share ideas and become friendly with each other, and that can enhance group productivity. Now, if taken to excess, it can also cause a lot of problems. And Slingerland and others would also emphasize that alcohol can, at an individual level, reduce stress and tension, although if taken to excess, it can greatly increase them. We always have to remember the dose issue here. A really interesting question for me is whether alcohol is especially useful for introverted people in social situations. So a little graphic I took off the internet, well, two of them here, one introverted but willing to discuss drinking vodka. Presumably the introvert would become much less introverted after the vodka consumption. But then another one saying that there's a myth that an introvert who takes alcohol can become an extrovert, and claiming the reality is that an introvert who takes alcohol simply becomes a drunk introvert. Well, I want to back up a little bit. What do we mean by drunk? Do we mean under the effect of alcohol, or do we mean seriously under the effect, having engaged in overconsumption? I have to talk a little bit about my own personal experience here. That's always a tricky thing to do. Just one example, but we all have our own lived experiences that shape our views. And I myself am a rather introverted person. I have a difficult time socializing with strangers. And I will not go to a party if it's going to have mostly people I don't know and there's no alcohol being offered, because I'm going to have a difficult time and I'm not going to enjoy it. If alcohol is present, on the other hand, I'm a moderate social drinker. But under those circumstances, I'll have a few drinks, I'll loosen up, I will gladly talk to people I don't know, and I'll generally have a good time. So I think as an introvert, alcohol plays a very important social role. But it obviously doesn't for everyone. In fact, there's some evidence that introverts are especially prone to alcoholism. That's been something that several scientific studies have come up with. You could look at the article mentioned here, and I believe it links to those studies, and you can look at that. And I'll end this part of the discussion by looking at song lyrics. Well, lyrics from one particular song called Alcohol by a group known as the Bare Naked Ladies. I think song lyrics, poetry, can often illuminate aspects that of any sort of phenomena that can be difficult to see through analytical discussions. So in this song, alcohol is, well, the author of the lyrics note is my permanent accessory and a party time necessity, but also an alternative to feeling like yourself. I like this song because it has both pluses and minuses, pros and cons in the same time. Or again, in highlighted text in red, but now I know there's a time and there's a place where I can choose to walk the fine line between self-control and self-abuse. Well, that is a fine line indeed. And then it ends with, would you please ignore that you found me on the floor trying on your camisole. So the problems of alcohol consumption are outlined here, I think, quite well, as are some of the benefits. And well, actually, this is the final note on this subject. I don't have enough time really to go into alcoholism. Obviously, alcohol is an extremely dangerous substance for those who incline towards this or have this as a personal issue with them. And I am interested, though, in what percentage of the population is alcohol. What percentage of the drinking population? I asked GPT to give me an answer. And it's the same as I saw in many other sources. About 6 to 7% of alcohol drinkers might be considered alcoholics. It's going to vary from society to society on how one defines alcoholism. There's no easy way to define it. Moving on to what alcohol is and what it does, I want to note its ubiquity in nature. Overripe fruit will naturally start to ferment. The yeast in the air is ubiquitous. The right kinds of yeast will land on it. Fermentation will start to occur. And so even a really ripe banana is going to contain some alcohol. Not enough to get you drunk. You would have to eat more bananas than you could eat. Bread rises through the process of ethanol fermentation, and it creates bubbles of carbon dioxide and ethanol fumes. The ethanol basically evaporates away, but there's a little bit, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but again, you're not going to be able to get drunk by eating bread. It doesn't have enough. But many other common foods have some alcohol. Now, what is alcohol? Ethanol is the sort of proper name for it. Ethanol is produced by what is known as ethanol fermentation. So fermentation is a process where sugars are broken down by certain kinds of yeast into both ethanol and carbon dioxide, or we can see it there in chemical terms. Now, there are other kinds of fermentation, and you should not confuse ethanol fermentation with lactic acid fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation is where sugars are broken down by certain kind of bacteria, lactobacillus, that creates lactic acid. So you find this in yogurt and sauerkraut, kimchi. There are many kinds of fermented food, and there's usually a little bit of alcohol involved in this by ethanol fermentation, but not very much. A lot of interesting scientific research on when people started drinking alcohol, and one thesis is, well, we were drinking alcohol before we were fully human, that our primate ancestors. In fact, this article claims that early, our ancestors who were frugivores ate a lot of fruit. Well, they ate other things. They were omnivores, certainly. If you go back far enough, though, you find a lot of primates eat a tremendous amount of fruit. And anyway, this article argues that our primate ancestors may have been able to smell plumes of ethanol, leading them to overripe fruits, which have a lot of nutritional benefits, a lot of calories, also a lot of vitamins as well. The article goes on to say that excessive consumption of alcohol by modern humans might result from pre-existing sensory biases associated with ethanol and nutritional reward. That's taking a couple steps too far for my own comfort. I think that's a bit too speculative. But one thing, again, and I've mentioned this, but it's important to reiterate, is that a lot of fruit will spontaneously ferment. Something else that spontaneously ferments and does so much faster is sap from, especially from palm trees. Palm trees, many species can be easily tapped for their sap. You can other plants are tapped for sap, like maple trees for maple syrup, which will ferment. Believe me, it has a high sugar content. But palm sap, for many palms, is very sweet. There's a tremendous amount of yeast in the air, and it can, according to Wikipedia, within 2 hours, fermentation of palm sap will yield an aromatic wine of about 4%. So that's similar to many beers, be a little bit lower than average beer today, but that's certainly in the beer range. Mildly intoxicating and sweet. Let it ferment a little longer, you'll get a slightly stronger alcohol, and then leave it for a couple of weeks, and you can have vinegar instead. That's produced by a secondary process where a species of, or several species of bacteria break down the ethanol and form acetic acid. And so in earlier days, before proper storage techniques were developed, alcohol would automatically turn to vinegar, and so you had to drink it pretty quickly. People eventually learned how to keep air out of alcohol, in a wine bottle, for example, with a cork, which would allow it to actually age and improve, not turn to vinegar. It's interesting, in southwestern India, the state of Kerala, toddy tapping. This is tapping palm trees to get the sap to turn it into toddy alcohol, which it does very, very quickly. It's actually a tourist attraction because we have this sort of high wire act of young men generally up high in the trees tapping them for this sap. And it's not just palms. You can do this with agave plants, often called century plants, very common in much of southwest U.S. and Mexico. Could be quite large plants. They'd have a tremendous amount of sap. You hollow out the crown of these things. The sap will collect gallons of it, and then it will very quickly turn to pulque. This was a traditional alcoholic beverage of the ancient Aztecs and other people who lived in Mesoamerica, still very widely consumed in Mexico. Don't confuse it with tequila, which has been distilled from a slightly different process, but pulque is ubiquitous and sort of it's a popular drink. Now, if we look at the main sources of alcohol today, we see that most of them have certain problems. So let's take the easiest to ferment, palm sap or agave sap. Well, these plants are mostly limited to the tropics. You aren't going to find palm trees in temperate environments. Agaves will grow in some dry temperate environments, but this is basically was a pan-tropical method of producing alcohol, not so suited for the temperate zone. Fruit, much more suited to the temperate zone and the tropics, well, on the whole globe. There's plenty of sweet fruits that can be easily fermented. Wine is obviously the most common, fruit of the grape, vine, cider from apples, perry from pears. I mean, there's all kinds of fruit wines that can be made. Or in East Africa, banana beer, it's called beer, but it's the same sort of process. These sugar-rich fruit juices can be easily fermented. You don't need a special strain of yeast. There's just enough yeast in the natural environment. You want to have higher quality products, you need to develop and select your own yeast strains. But, well, actually interesting, some of the highest quality beer just comes from natural yeast in the air. We'll talk about that. Now, what are the problems? Well, in the temperate world, you have your fruit. It ripens at one time of the year. You can easily make your wine. But like I say, in earlier days, the wine would have quickly turned to vinegar. Although people from very early days started figuring out how to make wine last longer. And basically were able to solve those problems. But it took some time. Now, honey, very rich in sugar, will ferment very easily, mixed with water. That creates mead. It was very important at one time. Our term honeymoon comes from a month of newlywed life, supposedly ideally devoted to relaxing and drinking mead, drinking honey wine, if you will. But honey was very expensive. It was very important in early societies, say Iron Age societies, for wealthy warlords to attract and maintain a retinue of warriors serving their cause by feasting with them, but providing not just food, but especially mead, very high quality alcohol. If you've ever read the Old English poem Beowulf, you would have encountered this with Lord Hrothgar's mead hall, where he entertains his warriors, and then the beast Grendel comes in to attack them at night. Mare's milk is another very important source of alcohol. Cow's milk doesn't contain enough sugar, nor does goat's milk or sheep's milk, but mare's milk does. It's sweeter. And this was, and to a large extent still is, the basic alcoholic drink of the nomadic people of Central Asia, Mongols, various Turkic-speaking peoples, many of them who still follow a nomadic lifestyle today, raising their flocks of animals. But for thousands of years, their main alcoholic beverage has been kumis, that's in the Turkic language, or arag in Mongol. There is a problem, though. The sugar content, even in mare's milk or donkey's milk, is barely adequate, and you can get only up to about 2.5% alcohol. And that is enough to feel the effects, but you have to drink a lot. It also makes it difficult to get wildly intoxicated. Very, very difficult, as your belly will be filled with fermented milk. But it is a beloved product in Central Asia. Now, the most convenient sources all have problems. So by convenient, I mean carbohydrate or starch-rich products that are easily stored and are highly abundant. So tubers like sweet potatoes or even potatoes, cassava, would be one example. Or more important in the history of alcohol, at least in the temperate zone, would be grain. Could be any kind of grain. Barley, most important for beer. Wheat is used as well. Rice for rice wine or rice beer. Millet has been used for the same purposes. But the big problem here is they don't have enough sugar to ferment. What they have are starches, and starches are basically sugars put in long chains, and the yeast can't break those chains down, and the yeast needs sugar to ferment. So you need to if you're going to use grain or tubers for alcohol production, basically you have to have it undergo saccharification. In other words, turning starches to sugars. And there are three main ways of doing this. The most important is malting. So let's start with that. And this is the basic way that beer is made, as well as a lot of distilled spirits, like whiskey, for example, starts out the same way. And here we have a photo of a traditional malting floor at a distillery in Scotland. And we're starting with grain. Barley's it's the easiest and most important, but other grains can be used as well. So what happens in malting is you start to germinate the seed. And when you start to germinate, you do that by soaking it in water and keeping it in wet. The germination process starts. It actually starts growing. You start getting a little tiny sort of root coming out of it. But what's happening is natural enzymes are being activated. Those enzymes are breaking down the starch chains into sugars, and the sugar is going to be what powers the growth of the plant until it can start to photosynthesize and make its own energy. And so in malting, again, you get the grain wet. You expose it to the air. It starts to germinate. And then when you're at the right stage and you have lots of enzymes in that grain, starting to convert the starches to sugars, then you basically stop the process. You dry it out. That's going to stop germination, but you still got the enzymes. Then you turn it into the mash, and the enzymes are turning the starch into sugar, and the yeast is turning sugar into alcohol. So it's a number of particular kinds of sugars. Maltose is the most important one. And it's interesting, malt is still, and formerly to a greater extent, was used as a source of sweetness because malt is sweet. So malted milk, for example, used to be more popular than it is today. Or malted milk balls. There's a layer of chocolate around the outside, but the inside of those, if you've ever eaten, is quite sweet, and that's actually malt. I find when I ask people about this, most people have no idea what the malt is in a malted milk ball. So anyway, malting is by far the most important way globally of converting the starches in grain to sugar that can be fermented. Now, in some parts of the world, though, a different technique is used. It's particularly in the Amazon, where there is a traditional alcoholic beverage called chicha. It's made out of fermented corn. Corn, again, doesn't have enough sugar, but it's cooked, and in this case, it is chewed up. And there are enzymes in the saliva that do the same thing as the enzyme in the malted grain. It starts to convert the starch in that grain into maltose. So actually the way chicha is traditionally prepared is the corn is chewed up, it's spat out, it's dried up, and then that is used for the fermentation process. And interesting, New York Times has a fairly, well, not so recent article on it. Chew it up, spit it out, then brew. Cheers, the Peruvian way. In East Asia, with rice wine, a different method altogether is and has been traditionally used. And that's to saccharify or create sugars through mold, known in Japanese as koji. So here we start by cooking the rice, wash, soak, steam, and then inoculate it with a particular bacteria. And the bacteria is going to be breaking down the starch into sugars. That's the way it's metabolizing them. And then you go from the bacteria, and then once you get enough sugar, then you inoculate it with the yeast, or just use natural yeast to turn it into sake. And then if you want to make rice wine vinegar, then you inoculate it with a different kind of bacteria to transform the ethanol into acetic acid. Koji is actually Japan's national microorganism. I don't think we have one in the United States or many other countries. But koji is really important in Japanese cuisine because it's not just sake, it's making soy sauce and making miso. Koji is used. So it has been designated as this national microorganism. In Tokugawa, Japan, that was Japan from 1600 to the mid 1800s, koji makers were some of the most highly paid people outside of the elite caste. They would travel around Japan. They had their own koji strains. It was kind of maintaining these and keeping them going was sort of a craft secret to a certain extent. So it's a very important thing. What is most interesting about koji is a species of the genus Aspergillus. And Aspergillus, other species, are in general bad news. They can get into the lungs and cause a serious and often deadly disease. Black mold in houses, which is incredibly destructive, is from a species of Aspergillus. Certain kind of smut in corn and other grains comes from Aspergillus. So here's this genus that produces really potent toxins, aflatoxins, but yet this one is the national microorganism of Japan. Well, what happened, and we know this now from genetic analysis, is ancient Japanese, but it happened, excuse me, happened in China as well. We just know more about it from Japan and Korea too, for that matter. But ancient East Asian people domesticated it. They found somehow strains of Aspergillus that had mutated so they didn't produce these toxic aflatoxins, which are carcinogenic and mutagenic. I mean, they are bad news indeed. But they found this mutated variety and then bred it, created essentially a different species. One other thing I need to note about alcohol consumption in East Asia is about 33% of East Asians have a real difficult time with alcohol. This is a genetic trait. It comes from a deficiency in a certain enzyme. They drink alcohol. If you have this condition, your face and times your whole body will flush red. You can have all sorts of skin issues and discomfort from drinking it. But it's an interesting issue. Why is this trait so common in East Asia, and did it initiate and then spread? Well, one interesting thesis, I have no idea whether this is true or not, I just find it intriguing. It's outlined in the second paragraph here, claims that this was actually advantageous in early agricultural times, because with the spread of wet rice agriculture, you had a very abundant crop, highly productive. You could make alcohol from it and basically become your staple crop. But it also led to a lot of infections, particularly from kinds of amoeba living in rice paddies and other places, which can cause parasitic infections. And if you have these high concentrations of acetaldehyde, which comes when you have this, if you drink alcohol and you have the alcohol flush reaction, you'll get these elevated levels, and that can confer protection against certain parasitic infections. Or so goes this theory. Like I say, intriguing. But it is interesting how notable this flush reaction is. So this pie chart is showing it in different populations. Where you have a lot of green, that shows a very high percentage. So it's shown here as highest in southern China and Japan, quite a bit less in northern China, but still quite prevalent. You get to Mongolia or India, Southeast Asia, it almost disappears. Note that it's almost gone from Taiwan, but these are not Han Chinese Taiwanese, who are 98%, but rather the so-called Taiwanese aboriginals, who are more related to people of Southeast Asia. They're only about 2% of the country. Globally, as far as alcohol consumption is concerned, there's a map, fairly crude map that I made. I showed it in the first lecture, but just notice how widely alcohol was consumed across the world before 1500. Pretty much everywhere in Eurasia and Africa and South America, Mesoamerica, up into the southwest United States. There's some reports of Iroquoian people fermenting maple syrup, or of peoples like the Cherokee or Chickasaw, Choctaw in southeastern U.S. making alcohol. But if they did, it wasn't done on a regular basis. There's very little evidence that it was regularly consumed. It also wasn't consumed in the Pacific, in Australia, so it had this very widespread but not global distribution. And it would be globalized very rapidly after 1500. But also, interestingly, in that core of that alcohol zone is where we have the most widespread prohibitions, religious prohibitions associated with Islam, certain caste groups in Hinduism, particularly high caste groups, although not all high caste groups, not the military ones, and Theravada Buddhism, the more orthodox form of Buddhism found in mainland Southeast Asia and in Sri Lanka. When did we first use alcohol? You can see graphs like this that have claim to illustrate when humans started experimenting with alcohols, with alcoholic beverages and other drugs, and it gives the first evidence. But that is the first really incontrovertible archaeological evidence, or evidence from textual sources or others. So for cannabis, for example, to get this evidence means exhuming an artifact, say a brazier that was fires were lit in, and you find, there are cannabis residues in there. Well, that's pretty good evidence that they were burning cannabis in this. I mean, it could have just been as an incense, more likely as a mind-altering substance. But for a lot of forms of alcohol or other drugs, the evidence is simply not there. It doesn't mean people were not drinking alcohol. A lot of places there's good evidence, but it's not quite this chemical lodestar where you can just say with no uncertain terms alcohol was being made. But there's a lot of more intangible evidence that it was. So beware of this. And almost all scholars of the subject think that beer came before wine, although in this chart we have rice wine 1,000 years before grape wine, a couple thousand years before beer. So beware this. Anyway, if we do have this confirmed alcoholic beverage, we know from archaeological remains, the earliest one is from China, about 9,000 years ago, early agricultural period. It was mixed, so it had rice in it, but they didn't know how to saccharide the rice at that time, so rice itself wasn't enough. But it also had honey. Well, that's got plenty of sugars. Hawthorn fruit and or grape. It's very interesting. Hawthorn is a common hedge-forming plant. It's thorny. It has beautiful flowers. It's bred in the United States, for example, for its flowers. And the fruits are almost never consumed. But not only in China, but in Europe as well. At one time, haws, the fruit of the hawthorn, was widely used. Actually, in China, there are improved cultivars, and you can buy hawthorn as a fruit or a processed hawthorn. Like I say, though, most of the evidence suggests that beer came well before wine, and I use beer in a very broad term here. I mean, fermented grains. Palm toddies undoubtedly came earlier than this. There's just no evidence for it. Plus, a lot of the archaeological and historical research has been focused on places that had early literary traditions, were actually producing texts and societies that we can analyze historically and not just archaeologically. So that gives a sort of a certain bias to this. But anyway, there is a lot of suggestive evidence that beer making, in other words, taking grain and somehow turning it into alcohol, in the ancient Near East or Middle East, the so-called Fertile Crescent in the Eastern Mediterranean, on into Iraq and Iran, Syria, parts of Turkey. This is a place where we have our first really good evidence of agriculture having been developed, the so-called Neolithic Revolution, going back some 11,000, 12,000 years ago. But for a long time, most scholars thought that, well, first grains were domesticated, they were eaten, at first as gruel, then maybe as bread, and then people discover that we can somehow start the germination process and malt it and create beer. The new line of thinking is actually beer came first, before bread. Actually, even before agriculture, wild grains were being harvested. They were being somehow malted and turned into alcoholic beverages. Here's an article from Stanford University a few years back. Ancient thirst for beer may have inspired agriculture, Stanford archaeologists say. Excavations among the Natufian people, they were hunter-gatherers right before the agricultural revolution in the Eastern Mediterranean. And there's not direct evidence that they were drinking alcoholic beverages created from grain, but a lot of indirect stone mortars. We have things that look like it was a beer brewing operation. We don't have the beer remains, though. I would say, though, the idea that beer before bread is a bit misleading, because bread was not the first food from grains, whether wild or domesticated. They were first cooked as gruel. And so maybe we could say beer coincident with gruel, because if those grains have been sprouted at all, if they've started to malt, then your leftover gruel the next morning, it can be alcoholic, and that may well have been how alcohol in this form was discovered. But we find lots of interesting articles. This is now over a decade old, but New York Times, how beer gave us civilization. As I mentioned before, I'm a little wary of this kind of formulation. I don't think beer gave us civilization, but it does seem to have been wrapped up in the earliest civilization. And by civilization, I want to be very precise in what I mean. I mean larger scale organized societies with urbanization, with governments, and with literacy as well. If you get all three of those, you have what scholars would generally call a civilization. And most evidence suggests that it was Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq, southern Iraq, where civilization in this sense first emerged. But it's interesting, this article talks about this Eastern Mediterranean Fertile Crescent area, but then goes on to say in Mexico, something very similar looks true. It looks like the ancestral progenitor of maize or corn is something called teosinte, a very different kind of plant. But its seeds were well suited for making beer, but not so much for making flour for tortillas. So thinking, well, maybe here as well, you had a gruel first, and that gruel quickly fermented. One of the most interesting sites for this kind of work is an archaeological site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. Pretty amazing site because it has large stone edifices, and these stones have been moved and worked, and there's all kinds of symbolism on them. But it turns out the people who made it were not agriculturalists. This was right before the agricultural revolution. They were hunter-gatherers, and this was not a permanently inhabited site. It looks like it was a seasonally inhabited site, but probably inhabited seasonally by many thousands of people who came together from large areas, and they were like I say, just beginning to intensely use wild grains and beginning to domesticate them. But it looks like in these large seasonal religious ritual gatherings, they were brewing beer. And so we have beer brewing troughs. We don't have the remains of that can show us that, definitely it was alcohol production, but it's pretty good evidence as it is. And this is also tied up with a certain thesis that this process of having a feasting, or what we call competitive feasting, was tied up with the origins of complex societies, where you have large numbers of people from a number of different sort of bands who are living together would annually congregate. You'd have these big feasts, lots of different food, alcohol as well, and certain sort of organizers of these are competing to put on the best feasts, and perhaps they could then transition into an elite class, and this could lead to more complicated societies. This is conjectural. We don't know it, but there's a lot of conjecture that's going on. Just to read from this, feasting and brewing very likely provided the key link between increasing complexity, in other words, larger numbers of people, more division of labor, more organized rule, and the adoption of cereal cultivation. And it has been applied to other psychoactive substances, such as coca leaves, from which cocaine comes, in the Andean region. We'll talk about this later. Let's look at Sumer or Sumeria in what is now southern into central Iraq, usually considered the world's first civilization, had their own language. It's been extinct for thousands of years, but we can read it. They produced a lot of texts on clay tablets that were easily preserved. We've exhumed a lot of those. We know we've been able to read many of their myths. Most of those clay tablets are basically accounting sheets, but some of them have very interesting information. But Sumer is in a very dry area, but lots of water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, so irrigated agriculture in a very fertile lowland environment, produced large surplus of wheat and barley. Barley is the key here for alcohol. You can make wheat beer, but it's not nearly as good. Too much gluten. But anyway, probably the world's first cities. It depends on how you define a city, but aggregations of 10,000 people or more, with many job specializations. Not, you can have a very large village of 5,000 people, but everybody leaves the village to go into agricultural fields. That's not a true city. A true city it's not an agricultural unit, although people can still leave cities to go out to their fields, but it has a complex division of labor and some sort of political structure. We had our proto-writing. It's not completely deciphered, but symbols that seem to have indicated concepts and numbers, and then actual writing, texts, literature developing from about 5,000 years ago. Beer in Sumer and its importance is well known. It's well known from the clay tablets we have. Just to quote the Wikipedia article on the people of ancient Mesopotamia, enjoyed beer so much that it was a daily dietary staple. Paintings, poems, myths depict humans and their gods enjoying beer, which was consumed through a straw to filter out the pieces of bread or herbs in the drinks. This was a thick, porridgey-like substance. You couldn't, would be ill-advised to just drink it straight out of a cup. So it was in these large vessels in which it was brewed. People would gather around them with these very, very long straws. Interesting, people, well, no surprise, are reviving ancient Sumerian beer. It's a very thick substance. I got to drink it pretty quickly, but yes, it is being done. And we have not only descriptions of beer, we have like these beer ration tablets. So we know what this was. People would often be paid in beer, given rations in beer. And this one is almost 5,000 years ago, from very early in Sumerian history. It's all tied up with their account of the origin of civilization. So there's a famous poem from Sumeria, although it continued with other societies after the Sumerian language went extinct. Their myths, many of their practices lived on. So Inanna, queen of heaven, becomes Ishtar, and the Semitic-speaking peoples who replace the Sumerians. Goddess of love, of war, and of fertility. Very, very important goddess. A famous poem of Inanna and the god of wisdom. So here's Inanna, the queen of heaven, goddess of love, war, and fertility, is drinking with the god of wisdom. They're drinking together, and the god of wisdom, Enki, he becomes so drunk, he gives away the sacred laws of civilization to Inanna, who then gives them to humanity, and that's how civilization originates, in a drunken fest between two gods. Sumeria had its own beer goddess, though, Ninkasi, associated with both positive and negative consequences of alcohol consumption. Sometimes it's been called the divine barmaid. There's a surviving hymn to Ninkasi that has really been analyzed to try to see if does this really give us a recipe to show us how the Sumerians made beer. There's a lot of discussion in it of a substance called bapir that's long been presumed to be a kind of dried out bread that perhaps they added to the malted grains. It's uncertain exactly how that was. Recent scholarship says we really don't know what this is. But it is intriguing that the American Homebrewers Association has a Ninkasi Award. So here's part of this hymn to Ninkasi. It's been translated. I'll just read a little bits of it in the red boxes. You are the one who handles the dough and with a big shovel mixes it in a pit, the bapir and sweet aromatics. Beer was often flavored, usually flavored. Ninkasi, you are the one who handles the dough and with a big shovel mixes in the pit, mixes the bapir with date honey. Well, that's very interesting because concentrated date, or a sort of a date extraction liquid, it's going to have plenty of sugar to ferment. But then at the end, it's interesting. We get to malt, though. Ninkasi, you are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. The noble dogs keep away even the potentates, the wealthy, powerful people. Noble dogs. Well, I find that pretty interesting, but a little bit confusing. The world's oldest epic, which dates back to Sumer, or Sumeria again, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is about a king who seeks immortality and goes on a long expedition to get wood out of the mountains of the north. There's not much wood growing in Sumeria or Sumer. But anyway, one thing that Gilgamesh does is he meets the wild man Enkidu and domesticates him, essentially. Enkidu is given beer to drink, and it's interesting. He ate. Well, it was a thick porridge, so he ate or drank. Well, sort of the same thing. He ate until he was drunk. He ate until he was full, and then he drank 7 pitchers of beer. His heart grew light, his face glowed, and he sang out with joy. But really, to civilize Enkidu, they had to bring a priestess from the temple of Inanna, or Ishtar, who made love to him. Temples to Inanna were sometimes associated with what has been known as temple prostitution. Anyway, taught him to wear clothes, taught him to eat bread, and taught him to drink beer. That was essential to civilization. Moving on to wine from grapes. We don't know exactly where it was domesticated. Increasingly, the evidence suggests what is today the Republic of Georgia in the western Caucasus Mountains, just east of the Black Sea. You can see the wild plant, Vitis sylvestris, which was domesticated to Venus vinifera. That shows where it grows. And the domestication, a big event happened because the flowers changed completely. The wild has male and female flowers on separate plants, whereas the domesticated one, they're on the same plant. That's the more common situation. Or more common is to have each flower has both male and female parts, but that's getting off topic. So anyway, the wine came from somewhere in this greater Mediterranean region, and like I say, probably in Georgia. There's biomolecular, archaeological, and archaeobotanical evidence dating back about 8,000 years ago or 6,000 BC. So pretty early, but this is a couple millennia after agriculture had developed. So it wasn't before, but after agriculture. The Georgians have a well-known wine industry to this day, more different kind of cultivars of wine grapes than any other part of the world, which in itself is good evidence that that's where it came from, because over time you get a proliferation of cultivars. So the area with the greatest diversity is often associated with, this is for any crop, associated with the area of domestication. The Georgians make their wine in a quite different way than we do today. It certainly didn't use wooden barrels. That came much later. But the Greeks used ceramic containers, as did the Georgians, kaveri, which are very large ceramic containers, which are mostly buried. You can see these all over Georgia today. They continue to be used. There's a lot of people making wine in Georgia, and you'll go into their wine shed and they'll have these buried containers. Georgia is interesting also because there has, in Georgia, there's been a great survival of the traditional, what we could call feasting, drinking, and toasting culture. In Georgia, even to this day, it's bad form just to open a bottle of wine and start drinking. If you're going to do it properly, you have a social context, and you're going to be doing it in a ritualized manner. It's going to be at a banquet where a lot of eating is done, and I should say there's a lot of evidence that drinking alcohol is much less dangerous and damaging to human and social health if it's done coincident with eating. As everyone who has done much alcohol drinking knows, if you have an empty stomach, you get drunk much, much faster. But anyway, in Georgia, you have drinking is ideally done, in these social gatherings. And, it can be very small, but it is still done in this ritualized way of eating and then toasting. You can see here a painting of, I think this is 18th century Georgia, and then a contemporary photograph, man standing up, wine glass, he's going to make a toast, he'll do the toast, someone else might follow up, and then you drink. And you don't drink until it's time for a toast. and it's very regulated. In fact, in these Georgian supras or feasts with wine, you have a person designated as tamada. Sometimes a tamada will be elected. I spent some time in Georgia in 2023, and I witnessed these on many occasions. It's where you start to feast and drink. Well, first you have to determine who is the tamada. And it's interesting. Here we have a 7th century BCE statue of someone who has been taken to be a tamada from the time. So the tamada is the toast master, or sometimes called the dictator of the banquet. They determine the order of toasts. Traditionally, it starts with things of a religious nature, but then moves on. But in a traditional Georgian supra, the tamada makes the toast. They're supposed to be clever, sometimes humorous, sometimes very serious, and then other people can follow up. But the tamada also determines when you drink, and determines when you end it. At least in my experience, you'll say, well, this is the second to last toast, and then it ends. So it's a highly ritualized and regulated form of drinking, survives to this day, and most likely this was the norm over most of the world in earlier periods. There's been a lot of work on the spread of wine. So this article here has sort of Georgia into Azerbaijan, and that black blob there labeled AAT, probable area of origin. And then you can see we have ancient routes going into Iran or Persia, down to Egypt. And then we have Greek dispersal and Roman diffusion, means basically the same thing, and then later expansion. It's a pretty good map, but it leaves out a very important group of people, and that's the ancient Phoenicians. So these were very important mercantile people, centered in what is now Lebanon, a little bit of northern Israel, a little bit of eastern Syria. Very important cities like Byblos, which gave us the name of the Bible, Sidon and Tyre. Phoenicians were the most important mercantile or merchant people in the Mediterranean in the early Iron Age. Later, they had a lot of competition from the Greeks. The Greeks were a bit more to the north. Phoenicians a bit more to the south. They founded Carthage, which would go on to outshine the Phoenician home cities and become the center of a very important empire that competed for power in the Western Mediterranean with Rome, and lost out in the so-called Punic Wars. But the Carthaginians were certainly wine drinkers, spread wine. They were also great agriculturalists. It's interesting. Well, the Phoenicians were the ones who developed the phonetic alphabet, on which all existing alphabets today, well, almost all, are based. Certainly, the Roman and Greek alphabets are based on the Phoenician alphabet. And the bit of this text here that I highlighted is very interesting. The entire literature of the people who invented the phonetic alphabet and taught it to Greece and Rome were consigned to flames. So when Rome conquered Carthage in the 2nd century BCE, they destroyed all of their libraries and books. There were libraries in Phoenicia proper that were destroyed as well. Their works did not survive. But the Romans did save a 28-book treatise on agriculture written by Mago, a Carthaginian writer, whom the Greeks and Romans alike call the father of farming. Well, he certainly wasn't the father of farming, but he was the first real sort of expert on it and expressed it in writing, and his writings were maintained. Wine, of course, was very important to the ancient Greeks. When you think about the ancient Greeks, don't think of Greece itself. That was the homeland, but the Greeks spread all over the Mediterranean. This map shows ancient Greek settlement and influence. It's exaggerated. They were in most areas just along the coast, didn't extend inland. The exceptions were Greece itself, southern Italy, but in most of those other areas, there were Greek cities on the coast. Plato famously said, or Socrates said, and Plato reported him saying that we Greeks are like frogs sitting around the edge of a pond. And then they traded with others, but they were in these urban-based cities, trade-based cities, I should say. They spread wine growing to France, for example. You could see Marseille was originally a Greek city, as there were many others in southern France, and that's how winemaking got to France. The Greeks, ancient Greeks, like the Georgians today, preferentially drank wine in a semi-formal wine drinking party, or symposion, or symposium. It was known in Latin, and we have that today as an academic gathering, but originally it was a drinking party. So this was part of Greek elite culture. I'm certain plenty of wine was consumed by the non-elites, and we don't know what kind of ritualized practices they may have had. But for the elites, we have a lot of evidence what their symposiums were like. And it literally means to drink together. So it'd be after a meal. There'd be company, not just drinking, but there'd be music, dancing, recital. There'd be a lot of little games. I mean, they had this very important game called Kotobos, which is all about flinging the dregs of wine onto a target. Definitely a drinking game, kind of a little bit reminiscent of fraternity parties today. But in ancient Greece, these symposiums were for elite men. Women would be there, but they'd be as entertainers, generally enslaved people, flute players, dancers, singers, and the like. There'd be male and female slaves as well attending to them. They'd be reclining on couches. Sometimes these symposiums, though, were not just drinking exercises, but were devoted to more serious conversation. In fact, we have two famous surviving dialogues based on symposia. They both feature Socrates. Socrates didn't write anything, but his pupil Plato wrote a tremendous amount. He wrote it almost all in dialogues, well, perhaps all of it, in which Socrates was the main figure. Often it's hard to know really who's speaking, Socrates or Plato. But Plato has a famous symposium, and this was devoted to a particular kind of conversation, a conversation on the god of love, Eros. And guests go around, praising Eros and putting forward their views on what constitutes good love. This is where we get the idea of platonic love, of love. Socrates says, ideal love doesn't have the erotic aspect. It's not sexual love, although sexual love certainly played a role as well. But then we have another writer, not as famous, but certainly very important, Xenophon, who wrote a symposium that we have. It had Socrates in it, but it's very different. Plato's symposium is very serious. Xenophon's is sort of much lighter. There's more joking and playfulness. Socrates comes on as a much more playful person in Xenophon than he does in Plato, which is interesting. Now, at these symposium, the attendees, the symposiasts, were not supposed to get drunk. Ideally, they wouldn't, but we got a lot of evidence that they did. Here on this is an illustration on a crater, a wine container of a naked slave boy attending to a vomiting symposiast. In Plato's symposium, though, a very important figure named Alcibiades claims that no one has ever seen Socrates drunk. Socrates was noted for his moderation in all things. And it's interesting, if Socrates was the model, Alcibiades was sort of the anti-model, as he burst into the symposium with his friends and got roaringly drunk and went out on sort of a rampaging episode. Alcibiades later led a Greek fleet to Sicily in the Peloponnesian War very rashly, which was the beginning of the defeat of Athens by Sparta. But anyway, the important thing I have here in the text here is a fragment from a Greek play where the god of wine, Dionysus, describes proper and improper drinking. And for sensible men, I prepare 3 craters, one for health, second for love and pleasure, and the third for sleep. After the third is drained, the wise men go home. The fourth is not mine anymore. It belongs to bad behavior. The fifth for shouting, the sixth for rudeness and insults, the seventh for fights, the eighth for breaking the furniture, the ninth for depression, the 10th for madness and unconsciousness. So certainly ancient Greeks were well aware of the problems of alcohol. One thing I will note is that in ancient Greece, the symposia were for men. Now, actually, there were women, like I say, could be present as entertainers, enslaved women. Although actually powerful women could be present too. Courtesans, women who were not respectable, considered because they would have sex outside of their marriage. But they were actually some of the most, could be very powerful and influential people. The courtesan Phryne was so powerful, she endowed temples and built them. The wealthiest men in Athens vied for her affection and spent lavishly on her, so courtesans could be present, but not respectable women. It wasn't quite as strict in Rome, ancient Rome. Women they didn't quite have the symposium institution in Rome, but some things pretty similar. But the society the civilization sort of came before the Romans in central Italy, the Etruscans, who the Romans conquered and basically amalgamated with. But the Etruscans, we know them mostly from their amazing art. They had symposia very much like the Greeks. I'm sure they called it something different, but we have women and men as equal attendees. The women here in red, men with blue sashes. We have a naked slave boy attending to them as well. In ancient Greece, respectable women could drink in public only in one place, the annual festival of Dionysus, the god of wine. And everyone participated in these, and there was a lot of drinking involved, but women, children, servants, slaves. So excessive wine drinking was part of a celebration of two seemingly unrelated things, springtime and death. Well, they're not unrelated. It's death and rebirth, which was what this was all about. And Dionysus, also called Bacchus, the Romans called him Bacchus, was a very important god. You can see in statues often the grapes flowing out of his hair. But he was the god of wine, of vegetation, a god of fertility, festivity, ritual madness, religious ecstasy, and theater. And one of the 12 Olympians, so a very, very important god. Anyway, the god of winemaking, of orchards, known as Bacchus for the frenzy that he sometimes could cause. There's often a contrast made between the god Dionysus and the god Apollo. This is particularly notable in the work by Friedrich Nietzsche called The Birth of Tragedy, quite an influential work, but many other authors have made this comparison, whereas Apollo is the god of reason, of light, of rationality, of order, music as well. And that is often what ancient Greek society is associated with. But Nietzsche and others will say, well, there's this other side we have to encounter, and it's not the ancient Greece of rationality. It's the ancient Greece of drinking, and often of excessive drinking, and of going into these kind of almost ritual frenzies associated with it. The Bacchanalia, as it's called, spread to Rome. And the Romans were quite scandalized. Or I shouldn't say the Romans, Roman moralists, included most of their historians. So the historian Livy, the Bacchanalia's greatest offense arose from the indiscriminate mixing of freeborn Romans of both sexes and all ages at night, when passions are easily aroused, and given wine and unrestricted opportunity, and women are there. They outnumbered the men. His account has the consul stressing the overwhelmingly female nature and organization of the cult. And there's a lot of evidence that, a lot of the leaders of the cult of Dionysus or Bacchus were women, closely associated with it. And we can go deeper into this, but I'll move on, and I'll very quickly talk about wine in Persia. Now, Persia was converted to Islam very early in the spread of Islam in the mid-7th century. And Islam is, as everyone I'm sure knows, is opposed to alcohol. I mean, there are some debates about this. There's an injunction in the Quran against drinking wine. That's most Muslim scholars say, well, by wine you mean alcohol. There are some who have said, well, it doesn't mean all alcohol. It really means wine, or some would even say it really only means date wine. But in general, Islam disapproves of alcohol if it doesn't prohibit it, as it often does. Zoroastrianism was the religion of Iran or Persia before Islam came in. And in Zoroastrianism, a very different story. Wine is a symbol of liquid gold, as well as the moving fire of the radiant sun. Fire has a very important role in Zoroastrianism. Wine, therefore, had a ritual function, part of a ritual in which it's substituted for blood. Anyway, Islam comes in, replaces Zoroastrianism, which is now almost extinct, both in Iran and in India, where many Zoroastrians fled. There are only a few 100,000 left, probably only a couple tens of thousands in Iran. But doesn't mean wine disappeared with the coming of Islam. In the Safavid Empire, which was a large Persian empire in the early modern period, we have a lot of travelers' accounts. Well, we have many accounts of wine drinking. I find this one really interesting. 1627, English writer Thomas Herbert had been in the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, another Muslim empire, and the Safavid Empire of the Persians or Iranians. And he claimed that the Ottomans, they're prohibited by law, not just by religion, but by law, not to drink alcohol. But he said they still did so, but covertly in a hidden way. Actually, there were more than one Ottoman emperor who were alcoholics. So the elite certainly drank alcohol, and others did as well, but as against religious and civil law. The Iranians or Persians, on the other hand, he said, drank wine openly and often to excess, regardless of any religious prohibitions against it. And here we have the wine pourer in a Safavid court painting. And you can see this in Persian poetry, and it's difficult to exaggerate the importance of Persian poetry in the Middle East. So even for non-Persian peoples, Ottoman elites, for example, often knew Persian in part so that they could read and recite the best poetry. Yeah, there was Ottoman poetry too, but Persian poetry had the higher repute. And the Persian cultural realm at this time was not just Iran. It extended well into Afghanistan, Central Asia. Even in India, the Mughal Empire, Muslim empire at the same time, Persian was the court language for most of its history and was a dominant elite language. But anyway, you could look at these Persian poets. Omar Khayyam is the best known. Omar Khayyam was a mathematician. There's a lot of poetry attributed to him. We're not sure if he really wrote it. But the most famous line is, a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and thou. Well known in English as well. Hafez is the most probably important spiritual poet and mystic of the Persian tradition. And just to quote from one line here, bring me a cup of wine that is dark red and smells like musk. Don't bring me that expensive brand that tastes like money and smells like lust. Well, in the English translation. Difficult, if not impossible, to really translate poetry, so I can't say how it sounds in Persian. But here today in Shiraz, Iran, is the tomb of Hafez, very well maintained. And Shiraz is, interestingly, a kind of wine. Shiraz is sometimes called. There are debates of whether they're the same. But interesting, by the 9th century, and this is a couple hundred years after Islamization, the city of Shiraz had a reputation for producing the finest wine in the world and was Iran's wine capital. The export of Shiraz wine by European merchants is well documented. So today it's pretty hard to get wine in Iran. It's illegal. But that is because the current Iranian theocratic government is based on a very stringent and strict interpretation of Islam, of Shia Islam in particular, which is not what would have been found, what was found in earlier periods when much more lax interpretations were common. As a final note, I want to say a little bit about Ibn Sina or Avicenna. He was an Iranian Persian philosopher, mathematician, most important as a physician, a polymath, was his heyday was about 1,000 years ago. He's from what is today Central Asia, but definitely a Persian-speaking culture. He wrote in Arabic, but that was the most important language of scientific writing. But he was definitely a Persian speaker. And we have a lot of information on Avicenna. I should say he was equally important in the West. In the 11th into the 12th century in Europe, he was one of the most important physicians. His works were translated into Latin, and Aristotelian philosophers as well. A lot of commentaries on Aristotle translated from Avicenna into Latin. But as Frederick Starr, in a recent book, which I would highly recommend, The Genius of Their Age, Ibn Sina, al-Biruni, and the Lost Enlightenment of Central Asia and Iran in the about 1,000 years ago. It's no secret that Ibn Sina fueled his nightly seminars with large quantities of red wine. A disgusted Juzjani, who was his secretary and wrote the life of, wrote a lot about him, was actually disgusted by these drinking parties. Juzjani was more orthodox in his Islamic interpretation. Moving on to beer in medieval Europe, I have it, my slide titled here, Alewives and Monks, because those are the two most important brewers in the Middle Ages. Particularly women were for a long time the main brewsters, maltsters and brewsters who made beer. Yeah, it's not easy to do. Malting and making beer is a complicated process. But then monks became very important. This is sort of pre-commercialization. But before that, if you go back to the ancient world, north of the Alps, okay, we've talked a lot about beer brewing in ancient Mesopotamia, pretty similar in Egypt and other places in the Mediterranean. But it also spread quite early into the area north of the Alps, the Celtic people or Celtic people, and recently discovered, well, this is 2011, but archaeological evidence shown of a pretty big operation of digging a ditch, and then you pour in your barley and get it wet until it sprouts, and then you dry it and you light a fire. I mean, you could read this at your leisure, but they found these remains, and they know that the beer was among the Celtic people was flavored with a special mixture of plants known as gruit, and that continued well into the Middle Ages. And it could contain all sorts of herbaceous materials, carrot seeds. Now, what's interesting here is henbane, found in this, and some of these ancient archaeological excavations. Here's an article from Vice from a decade or so ago, How to Drink Hallucinogenic Beer Like a Viking Shaman. And again, it's taking henbane. We'll talk about henbane when we get to deliriants, the so-called plants of witchcraft, later on in this lecture series. But we know this from actually, excavating the remains of vessels that had beer in them, that they had remains of henbane. But as you see here, henbane isn't necessarily lethal, but it's close. Well, it is toxic and it is hallucinogenic, no doubt about that. But how much henbane was in it? Remember Paracelsus and his dictum, everything is a poison, nothing is a poison, it all depends on the dose. So a small amount of henbane is not going to be poisonous or psychedelic. It may give some flavor. It is interesting that Pilsen in Czechia, or the Czech Republic, one of Europe's first beer capitals, took its name from the German word for henbane. What we do know is that ancient or medieval Europeans drank beer, particularly those north of the Alps, south of the Alps, and in much of France, wine was more important. Get into Northern Europe, Central Europe, beer was the thing. And in the medieval period, people drank a lot of it. They didn't drink much water. Water was considered suspicious. It's dangerous. Well, they didn't boil their water. So water often had microorganisms that were debilitating. You get diarrhea. You could get worse. You get dysentery. Watch out for water. Now, it isn't true that they never drank water. There was spring water. Water was consumed. There's some people who say, oh, they never drank water. Well, that's not true. They did drink water, but they probably drank more beer, particularly where you lived. If you lived near a spring, well, then, yeah, you could get good water. But you lived in a town, chances are you could collect rainwater. People did that. But beer was the most important hydrating beverage. And a laborer would drink more than 5.7 liters of beer a day to quench their thirst. Does that mean they were always drunk? Well, there's a lot of debate on this. And so a lot of scholars say, well, they were drinking small beer. And so this is beer with an alcohol content of 0.5% to about 2.5%. 2.5% you can get drunk, although it's a bit difficult. 0.5% you can drink all day long, and you're not going to get drunk. You're not going to feel much of the effects of it. You'll metabolize it faster than you can get the alcohol in your bloodstream. So we know they were drinking a tremendous amount of beer. We know they were drinking a lot of small beer, but how much of their beer was small? Well, this is debated. Here's a recent article. I often go to the popular press, but this cites scholarly work with excavation of beer remains showing, oh, wow, this beer was as high as 5%. You'd certainly get drunk on 5% if you were to drink, if you were many pints of beer a day, yeah, you're going to be sort of chronically intoxicated. But this is just one case. The beer was probably from 0.5% all the way up to 8%, at which point the alcohol starts to kill off the yeast. With beer, with wine, you can get up to about 12%. With beer, it's hard to get that high. So anyway, much debated. What is well known, though, until the modern period, until the 1500s or 16th century, most beering was done at home by women. Now, monks were doing it in the monastery, and eventually I'll start selling it. But in the basic home economy, it's done by women. This is often just for domestic consumption, but alewives, women who had really specialized and perfected their techniques. Like I say, it's not difficult. It's not easy to brew a good beer. You have to know a lot. These were often women who had to make their own way in the world. Maybe they were widows. They had to sell things they made for money or trade them for other goods. And so you get, I should go back to this earlier slide. I'm sorry. You could see there on the top slide a woman in front of a very small house with a big broom outside it. And that broom would have been a sign that she had excess ale or beer that she was going to sell to the market. And so you get very similar illustrations. And Judith Bennett's work, this is a few decades old, but it was a very important work in not just the history of beer, but the history of feminism, because she shows how this was a female art, and then it was basically taken over by men as it begins to be commercialized in the modern period. And the women who did this are often held with quite a bit of suspicion. Like I say, these were generally often unmarried women who had their own way to support themselves, and sometimes support themselves pretty well by selling their beer. And so sometimes they were literally demonized. So here we have an illustration from a church in Salisbury in England of an alewife with her pitcher of ale there, literally sort of cradling and cuddling a demon. So there was some opposition and suspicion. Larger scale brewing was done by monks, generally for their own monastic communities, and they developed it. And they developed so much that today some of the most expensive beers you can find are produced by Trappist monasteries, particularly in Belgium, which is one of the real centers of beer production. And you can get some of these can be very, very expensive ales produced by Trappist monks and other monks as well. The first sort of commercial beer brewing outside of monasteries and outside of the sort of, very local alewife production, but producing beer in large enough quantities to put it in barrels, to export it, to send it to other cities, to be marketing at a large scale. This is in the late medieval period, 13th century. It's in towns in two regions. In Bohemia, that is the core of Czechia, or the Czech Republic, formerly western part of Czechoslovakia, and the other is Bavaria, which is in the southeastern part of Germany. I should note that Bohemia was at the time not German-speaking; it was Czech-speaking, as it is today. Czech being a Slavic language. But the towns, the cities of Bohemia in the medieval and early modern period were mostly German-speaking, and there were close associations. In fact, I sometimes like to show maps made by, sort of fictional maps made by people who are playing elaborate historical games and just sort of imagining ways things could have worked out. And this one was the Beer Empire. And note the Beer Empire was Bohemia, Bavaria, and some surrounding areas. And even today in the Czech Republic or Czechia, you find some very famous beer cities. The term Budweiser comes from a Czech city. Pilsner, which is a category of beer, which includes Budweiser, comes from the city of Pilsen, which, as I said before, comes originally from the name for henbane. Not only did these brewers in Czechia and Bohemia start commercializing beer, putting it in barrels, exporting it, but they developed a new kind of beer, which is bottom fermented beer, which are known as lagers or pilsens today. There are others. So it's a different kind of yeast. The fermentation happens, as the name implies, on the bottom, not on the top, as traditional, what I generally call ales, like bitters or various kinds of brown ales and red ales and amber ales. Pale ales have the top fermented versus the sort of lighter lagers and pilsens, bottom fermented. Spontaneous fermentation below, that is not using any particular kind of yeast. Bottom fermented, top fermented, you have your yeast strain that you're using. Spontaneous is you're just using the yeast that's in the natural environment. And you see some lambic ales there. They're some of the most expensive beers you can buy, but you're only going to be able to produce it in one place where there's a particular, array of yeast that are going to land and start the fermentation process. So anyway, it's actually known how this revolution to create these bottom fermented beers happened. It happened from the mating of one yeast species from Bohemia with another yeast species from Bavaria, which gave rise to a new yeast strain, which did the bottom fermenting. But it took a long time for these to become popular, partly because the bottom fermentation process needs colder temperatures, which could be done especially in some of the sort of higher elevation areas of Bohemia at the time. Once you get commercial cooling developed, then you could produce lager beers wherever, whenever, and it became globally more important than the traditional top fermented ales. Nearing the end of this presentation, but in Northern Europe, the main alternative to both beer and wine was cider from apples or perry from pears. So in the Mediterranean, wine most important. One thing I should have mentioned with wine was traditionally it was often diluted with water, and at those Greek drinking parties, it was always cut with water, often half and half. In Mediterranean, in Italy today, for example, adolescents are often introduced to wine with watered down variety. But anyway, going back to the slide here, this map shows two areas particularly well known for apple cider. the West Country in southern England. And if you go to pubs in that part of England, you'll find beer, but you're probably going to find more cider. It's going to be more a more popular drink to this day in many areas. In France, that map, this is an old map from 1873, but very interesting. Wine is all those areas in white. Blue are the beer areas, and that would be up near the border with Belgium, especially the north eastern part of the country. And then the northwest, Normandy in particular, but also Brittany, that was and is to this day the cider region. And there are some very high quality ciders produced there. In the United States, cider in early America, early years, apple cider was the most important alcoholic beverage. Couldn't really grow wine there. I mean, now they do, but in earlier periods it was impossible. Yeah, beer making was done, but apple cider was a lot easier to make, and especially along the frontier, it was all about apples. Most apples in the United States were grown for cider. Most cider was alcoholic. And in Britain today, if you say cider, you're talking about an alcoholic beverage. In the United States, you specify hard cider because you will have unfiltered apple juice, call it cider. But traditionally, cider meant alcoholic apple juice. There's a very well-known figure in American history and mythology, if you will, John Chapman or Johnny Appleseed, who was known for early 1800s moving into the area beyond the settlement frontier, areas that had just been sort of taken from indigenous Native American societies, where you didn't have European settlers yet, and he would establish apple nurseries, and the settlers would come in and buy rootstock from him to establish their apple orchards, because everyone needed an apple orchard. You ate apples, yes, that was important. Apples were eaten, but most apples, particularly the ones that maybe were a little wormy or pecked by birds, that goes into cider. So just to quote here, a settlement along the frontier sometimes included a legal requirement where an orchard of mature apple trees bearing fruit within 3 years of settlement were required. These plantings would guarantee land titles. It was really hard. We're often there before the surveying had been done. Who has title? Well, I got an apple orchard. That's good evidence. A little earlier, 1767, the average New England family was consuming 7 barrels of hard cider annually, 35 gallons per person. What I would like to know was the alcohol content of that cider, because it varied a lot. And my second to last slide, a book I would highly recommend, Michael Pollan, The Botany of Desire. He's got a chapter on apples. He's got one on marijuana or cannabis, one on tulips, and one on potatoes, if I remember right. And he's written a lot on, more recently, on psychedelic drugs. We'll talk about Michael Pollan later on. But he writes about Johnny Appleseed in his chapter on apples, believes that since Chapman was against grafting, his apples were not of an edible variety. Well, that's miswritten. It shouldn't be edible. You can eat any apple. It's just most of them weren't particularly tasty for just eating them, but they were good for cider. Cider apples are apples that are really good for cider are not the best eating apples. So really what he was doing was he was bringing the gift of alcohol to the frontier. He was our American Dionysus. Others would say he was really in the land speculation business. People want to debunk heroes like that. But he was a very interesting person, very strong, heterodox religious beliefs, and a lot of evidence was that he was really concerned about bringing the gifts of apples for eating and drinking and alcohol and other purposes to the frontier. So that's all I have for today. I hope within a week, be recording part 2 of this lecture, where I'll look at the distillation and invention of hard liquor, the invention of distillation, and the creation of hard liquor. You can't get alcohol more than about 12% with natural fermentation because the alcohol kills off the yeast. But there are a variety of ways of making it stronger, distillation being the most important. I'll talk a bit about the 18th century gin craze and its problems in the United Kingdom. I'll talk about the 19th century absinthe craze, particularly in France. And then I'll talk about modern prohibition movements, regional drinking patterns in the United States and in the world, and global and regional trends in alcohol consumption. So I hope you'll enjoy today's lecture, and I hope you'll be able to tune in to subsequent part 2 of the alcohol lecture and then the other lectures after that. Thank you.